Richard Ashford had built an empire from nothing. His tech conglomerate spanned 3 continents, his name graced the Forbes list year after year, and his influence reached the highest corridors of power. At 62, he'd conquered every challenge the business world threw at him. But the diagnosis from Dr. Morrison changed everything in an instant. Acute liver failure, complications from a rare genetic condition, 6 months to live without a transplant. Richard sat in the leather chair of the private medical suite, the words echoing in his mind like a death knell. His assistant, Marcus, stood frozen by the door, watching his invincible boss crumble. The donor list was long, Dr. Morrison explained, his voice gentle but clinical. Years long. Richard's rare blood type and tissue markers made finding a match nearly impossible. They'd need a family member, someone with his genetic profile. Richard's mind immediately went to his son, Thomas, but the doctor shook his head before he could speak. Thomas had been tested years ago for a kidney issue and wasn't compatible. That left only one possibility, one person Richard had tried to erase from his memory for 12 years. Lily, his daughter from his first marriage to Sarah Chin, a relationship he'd buried beneath layers of ambition and new families. He'd walked away when Lily was only 3, choosing his burgeoning career over the complications of fatherhood. The divorce settlement had been generous, he told himself, as if money could substitute for presence. Sarah had moved across the country and Richard had moved on, remarrying twice, building his fortune, and constructing a life where Lily was nothing more than a line item in his accountant's records. Now, as he stared at the manila folder Dr. Morrison placed in his hands, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: helplessness. The folder contained information about genetic compatibility, the transplant process, and a single photograph that Marcus had somehow obtained. Lily at 15, smiling at a school event, her mother's dark eyes staring back at him. She looked nothing like the toddler he remembered. She looked like a stranger. Marcus cleared his throat. "Sir, I should inform you that locating them was difficult." Ms. Chun changed their surname back to her maiden name. They live modestly in Portland. Lily is apparently an exceptional student, involved in community service, planning to study medicine. Each word was a dagger of guilt. Richard had missed everything. Every birthday, every school play, every milestone. And now he needed her. Not wanted her, needed her. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd abandoned his daughter now required her to save his life, to literally give him a piece of herself. He wondered if fate had a sense of humor, or if this was simply justice manifesting in its cruelest form. Sarah Chin stood at her kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes while Lily finished her homework at the table behind her. Their modest 2-bedroom apartment was filled with the warmth that comes from years of building a life together, just the two of them against the world. Sarah had worked multiple jobs to put food on the table, to save for Lily's college fund, to give her daughter everything except the one thing she couldn't provide: a father who cared. The knock on the door shattered the peaceful evening like a stone through glass. Marcus stood in the hallway, immaculately dressed, holding a briefcase that probably cost more than their monthly rent. Sarah recognized the type immediately: corporate messenger. Someone sent to handle the uncomfortable tasks wealthy people didn't want to dirty their hands with. Her heart began to race. In 15 years, Richard had never once reached out, never called, never sent so much as a birthday card beyond the legally mandated support checks. Whatever brought his representative to her door couldn't be good news. She opened it slowly, her body blocking the entrance, protecting Lily from whatever came next. The conversation was brief and brutal. Richard was dying. He needed a transplant. Lily was the only possible match. Marcus spoke in careful, measured tones, as if he were negotiating a business deal rather than asking a mother to volunteer her child for major surgery to save a man who'd never been a father. Sarah felt her vision narrow, rage and disbelief warring in her chest. He wanted Lily to save him. After everything, after all the missed moments and broken promises, he had the audacity to ask for this. She wanted to slam the door in Marcus's face, to protect her daughter from the man who'd caused so much pain. But Lily had appeared behind her, drawn by the tension in her mother's voice.
Mom?
What's going on? Sarah turned to see her daughter, brilliant and compassionate, the best thing that had ever happened to her, standing in the doorway with concern etched across her features. Marcus, sensing an opportunity, spoke directly to Lily, explaining the situation with careful precision. Richard Ashford was her biological father. He was very sick. The doctors believed she might be able to help. He'd like to meet her, to discuss the possibility. Sarah watched her daughter's face transform as the words sank in. Shock, confusion, hurt, and then something else, something that made Sarah's heart ache. Curiosity. Lily had asked about her father countless times over the years, creating elaborate fantasies about why he'd left, convincing herself that perhaps he'd had no choice, that circumstances beyond his control had kept him away. Sarah had tried to be honest without destroying her daughter's spirit, a delicate balance that never felt quite right. Now, the truth stood in their doorway, wearing an expensive suit, and there was no protecting Lily from it anymore. The girl who'd been abandoned had just learned that her absent father needed her to survive, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in her daughter's mind, weighing obligation against hurt, compassion against self-preservation. The restaurant Richard chose for their first meeting was absurdly upscale, the kind of place where reservations required months of advanced planning and entrees cost more than Sarah's weekly grocery budget. He'd insisted on neutral ground, somewhere public where they could talk without pressure. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. This man who'd never made time for a single visit now orchestrating elaborate settings for a meeting driven purely by his own desperation. She sat beside Lily at the pristine white tablecloth, her daughter's hand trembling slightly in her lap, both of them feeling utterly out of place among the crystal chandeliers and murmured conversations of the wealthy. Richard arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by Marcus and looking every inch the powerful executive despite the slight pallor that betrayed his illness. He'd aged, Sarah noted with grim satisfaction, the sharp features she'd once loved now weathered by decades of stress and excess. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They kept drifting to Lily with an expression she couldn't quite read. Regret? Hope? Desperation? Perhaps all three. He sat down across from them, clearing his throat awkwardly, and for the first time in her memory, Richard Ashford seemed uncertain of his words. Lily, he began, his voice rougher than Sarah remembered. I know I have no right to be here. No right to ask anything of you. Lily stared at him with those dark eyes she'd inherited from Sarah, her expression unreadable. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped her pick out, her long hair pulled back neatly. She looked poised and mature beyond her 15 years, and Sarah felt a surge of fierce pride in the young woman her daughter was becoming, despite everything. Richard continued, stumbling through an explanation of his illness, the technical details of the transplant, the fact that she was his only hope. What struck Sarah most was what he didn't say. There was no apology for the abandonment, no acknowledgement of the years of birthdays and Christmases he'd missed, no explanation for why his career had been more important than his child. He spoke about his condition as if it were a business problem requiring a practical solution, and Lily was simply the most efficient resource available. The restaurant noise faded into background static as Sarah watched her daughter absorb this, seeing the realization dawn that her father hadn't come back because he'd finally cared. He'd come back because he was dying and had nowhere else to turn. Lily finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Why now? Why, after all these years, do you suddenly remember I exist? Richard faltered, his corporate composure cracking. Because I'm dying, he said simply, and at least there was honesty in that. Because the doctors say you might be able to save me. And because, God help me, I'm selfish enough to ask. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and ugly. Sarah wanted to grab Lily's hand and walk out, to spare her daughter any more of his pain. But Lily sat perfectly still, studying the man who'd given her life and then abandoned it, weighing his words against a lifetime of absence. The question that would define everything came quietly, almost a whisper. If I do this, if I save you, will you finally want to know me? Or will I just be the person who gave you your second chance, and then you'll disappear again? The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and desperation, a combination that made Sarah's stomach churn as she accompanied Lily through the battery of tests. Dr. Morrison had insisted on comprehensive screening, blood work, tissue typing, psychological evaluation, the works. They needed to ensure Lily was not only medically compatible, but also emotionally prepared for what donating a portion of her liver would entail. It was major surgery, weeks of recovery, potential complications. The doctor had been thorough in explaining the risks, perhaps trying to discourage them, though Sarah couldn't tell if that was medical caution or moral judgment about the situation. Lily endured it all with remarkable composure, rolling up her sleeve for blood draws, answering the psychologist's probing questions about her motivations, sitting still during the endless scans and examinations. Sarah watched her daughter navigate this adult world with a maturity that shouldn't have been necessary at 15, and felt anger burning in her chest. This was Richard's doing, forcing their child into an impossible situation where compassion and obligation tangled into something unrecognizable. Yet when Sarah tried to give Lily an out, suggesting they could simply walk away, her daughter had shaken her head firmly. "I need to know, Mom," Lily had said during one of their quiet moments in the waiting room. "I need to know if I can live with myself if I don't at least try. I need to know what kind of person I am when faced with this choice." It was so like Lily, turning a nightmare into an exercise in self-discovery, trying to find meaning in pain. Sarah recognized herself in that determination, the same stubborn strength that had gotten them through years of struggle. But she also saw something purely Lily's, a compassion that exceeded anything Sarah could claim, a willingness to consider saving the man who'd hurt them most. The results came back positive. Lily was a near-perfect match, her tissue markers aligning with Richard's in a way that made Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rise with professional surprise. This level of compatibility is rare, even between parent and child, he explained, pulling up charts and graphs that meant nothing to Sarah, but everything to their future. "The transplant has an excellent chance of success. Of course, we'll need time to prepare, and Lily will need to gain medical clearance. She's young, healthy, perfect candidate from a physiological standpoint." He paused, studying them both. "The question isn't whether she can do this. The question is whether she should." It was the first time anyone had openly acknowledged the ethical minefield they were navigating. A 15-year-old girl, abandoned by her father, now being asked to undergo major surgery to save his life. The power dynamics were grotesque, and everyone in the room knew it. Dr. Morrison insisted on additional counseling sessions, time for Lily to truly consider her choice without pressure. Richard, to his credit or perhaps his lawyer's instruction, had stayed away during the testing, allowing Lily space to make her decision. But his presence loomed over everything, a dying man's shadow stretching across their lives, waiting for a verdict that would determine whether he lived or died. Sarah held Lily's hand as they left the hospital that day, knowing that whatever her daughter decided, nothing would ever be the same again. Lily sat on the beach, her favorite spot for thinking, watching the Pacific waves crash against the shore with relentless rhythm. She'd asked her mother for space to process everything, to sort through the tangled emotions without well-meaning interference. The decision should have been simple. Richard Ashford meant nothing to her, a ghost in her family tree, a name on abandoned support checks. He'd chosen his empire over his daughter without hesitation. Why should she risk her health, her future, for someone who'd never sacrificed anything for her? Yet nothing about this felt simple. She thought about the little girl she'd been, creating elaborate stories to explain her father's absence. Maybe he was a spy on a dangerous mission. Maybe he'd lost his memory and didn't know he had a daughter. Maybe he was searching for her every day but couldn't find them. Childish fantasies that her mother had gently dismantled as Lily grew older, replacing them with uncomfortable truths. He left. He chose not to be part of your life. Some people aren't capable of being parents. Lily had accepted it, or thought she had, building her identity around being the daughter of a single mother, finding father figures in teachers and coaches, and her best friend's dad, who always saved her a seat at soccer games. But acceptance and indifference weren't the same thing. The anger was still there, buried deep, but very much alive. She was angry that Richard had missed her childhood, angry that he never wanted to know the person she'd become, angry that his first contact in over a decade was a request for her literal flesh and blood. The anger felt righteous and justified, a shield against the hurt underneath. Yet alongside the anger lived something else, a stubborn compassion that her mother insisted came from Sarah's side of the family. Lily couldn't stop thinking about Richard dying, alone despite his wealth, reaching out in desperation to a daughter who owed him nothing. The transplant counselor had asked her pointed questions during their sessions. Are you doing this because you want to, or because you feel obligated? Are you hoping this will create a relationship with your father? Are you prepared for the possibility that, even after saving his life, he might still disappoint you? Lily had struggled to answer honestly. Yes, part of her hoped that this would be the beginning of something, that saving Richard's life might make him finally see her value, might make him want to be her father. But another part of her, the wiser part that sounded like her mother's voice, knew that was magical thinking. The decision, when it finally crystallized, came from an unexpected place. Lily realized she wasn't doing this for Richard at all. She was doing it for herself, for the person she wanted to be, for the values her mother had instilled in her about helping others even when it was hard. She was doing it so that years from now, when she looked back at this impossible moment, she could say she chose compassion over bitterness. Whether Richard deserved it was irrelevant. Whether he would change was beyond her control. But whether she could live with walking away from someone she had the power to save, that was something she had to answer for herself. She pulled out her phone and texted her mother a single word: yes. The waves continued their endless rhythm, indifferent to human drama, and Lily felt oddly at peace. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out, time for final preparations and for Lily to be in optimal physical condition for the procedure. Sarah had insisted on meeting with Richard's legal team before anything proceeded, her maternal instincts in full protective mode. If her daughter was going to do this, she wanted everything in writing. All medical expenses covered, a college fund established, and most importantly, no legal claims on future contact or relationship. Richard had agreed to everything without negotiation, either because his lawyers advised it or because he was truly desperate. Sarah suspected both. Richard had also requested a series of meetings with Lily before the surgery, supervised sessions where they could talk and perhaps begin to know each other. Dr. Morrison had recommended it, suggesting that some emotional connection might help both parties through the difficult recovery period ahead. Sarah had been skeptical, but Lily had agreed, her curiosity about her father finally getting an outlet after years of wondering. The first few meetings were awkward, stilted conversations in coffee shops where Richard seemed utterly lost on how to talk to a teenage girl he'd never bothered to know. Slowly, something shifted. Richard began sharing stories about his own childhood, his difficult relationship with his father, the drive that had pushed him to build his empire at the cost of everything else. He didn't offer these as excuses, but as explanations, fragments of understanding about how a man could make such catastrophic choices. Lily listened, asking sharp questions that made Richard flinch, refusing to let him paint himself as a victim of circumstances. You had choices, she said during their 4th meeting. You chose wrong. You chose your company over your family. That's not fate or bad luck. That's you deciding what mattered most. Richard had no defense against her honesty. Instead, he did something Sarah never expected. He agreed with her. You're right, he said quietly, staring into his coffee. I made terrible choices. I convinced myself that providing financially was enough, that my work mattered more than being present. I was wrong. I missed everything important, and I can never get those years back. I can never undo what I did to you and your mother. It wasn't the grand apology Sarah had sometimes imagined in her angriest moments, but it was something. An acknowledgement. A crack in the armor of Richard's certainty about his own righteousness. As the surgery date approached, Lily's anxiety began to show. She'd wake up from nightmares about operating tables, about something going wrong, about dying before she'd really lived. Sarah held her daughter through these moments, questioning her own judgment in allowing this to proceed, wondering if protecting Lily should have meant refusing no matter what. But Lily would steady herself each morning, reviewing the medical information Dr. Morrison had provided, focusing on the statistics that showed the relatively low risk, the high success rate. She was preparing herself mentally and physically, eating right, exercising gently, doing everything to ensure her body could handle the trauma of major surgery. The night before the operation, Richard came to their apartment for the first time, a strange reversal of Marcus's initial visit. He sat awkwardly on their second-hand couch, his expensive suit incongruous against the modest furnishings. "I don't know how to thank you," he said to Lily, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know if I even deserve this chance you're giving me." Lily looked at him steadily, this man who was both stranger and father, and said something that surprised them all. "You're right, you probably don't deserve it. But I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because I can and because I want to be someone who helps when they're able to help. What you do with this second chance is up to you, but don't waste it." It was a benediction and a challenge, grace offered without the promise of absolution. The pre-dawn darkness felt appropriate for what lay ahead, a liminal space between the life they'd known and whatever came next. Sarah and Lily arrived at the hospital at 5 a.m., navigating the quiet hallways to the surgical wing where teams were already preparing. Dr. Morrison met them personally, his manner calm and reassuring as he walked them through what would happen. Lily would go under first. The surgeons would remove approximately 60% of her liver, the portion that would then be transplanted into Richard. The liver's remarkable ability to regenerate meant both would eventually have full-sized, functioning organs, nature's elegant solution to this particular form of sacrifice. Lily changed into the hospital gown, looking impossibly young and vulnerable perched on the gurney. The nurses bustled around her, inserting IVs, checking vitals, making small talk designed to keep her calm. Sarah held her daughter's hand, fighting back tears, memorizing Lily's face as if she might forget it during the hours ahead. They'd been assured the risks were minimal, that liver donation had become increasingly safe, that Dr. Morrison was the best in his field. But no surgery was without risk, and Sarah couldn't shake the primal fear that she might lose her daughter to save a man who'd never valued her. "Mom," Lily said softly, squeezing Sarah's hand. "It's going to be okay. I'm going to be fine." It was so like Lily to comfort her mother even in this moment, this girl who'd grown up too fast because circumstances demanded it, who developed strength and compassion in the absence of the father who should have provided both. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the smell of hospital soap and underneath it, still, the little girl who'd once fit perfectly in her arms. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I'm so proud of you. You're the best thing I've ever done." The anesthesiologist arrived, explaining the process of sedation, how Lily would count backward from 10 and wake up hours later with no memory of the time in between. Lily nodded, her eyes already heavy with the pre-medication they'd given her. She looked toward the door where Richard waited in another prep room, kept separate until the actual surgery. "Tell him," Lily said drowsily. "Tell him I hope we both wake up on the other side of this. Tell him I want him to live well, to be better than he was." Then the medication took full effect, and Lily's eyes fluttered closed, her hand going slack in Sarah's grip. Sarah stood outside the operating room, watching through the small window as the surgical teams worked with focused precision. 2 rooms, 2 simultaneous operations, her daughter's body being open to give life to a man who'd never appreciated what he'd had. Marcus appeared beside her, offering coffee she didn't want, standing vigil with her through the longest 6 hours of her life. The waiting room filled with morning light, other families arriving for their own surgical dramas, life continuing its relentless forward motion while Sarah's world narrowed to that window and the small form on the table beyond it. She prayed to gods she wasn't sure she believed in, made bargains with the universe, promised anything if only Lily would be okay. The surgery that would save Richard Ashford or doom him had begun, but all Sarah cared about was the girl who'd agreed to this impossible act of mercy, the daughter who deserved so much better than the hand fate had dealt her. The first 72 hours after surgery were critical, Dr. Morrison had explained, the period when complications were most likely to manifest. Lily woke in the ICU, groggy and in pain despite the medications, her abdomen wrapped in bandages that seemed to cover half her small frame. Sarah was there when her eyes opened, had never left except when the nurses physically made her step out during procedures. "You did it," Sarah whispered, brushing hair from Lily's forehead. "You made it through. You're going to be okay." Lily's recovery was textbook perfect, the medical team said with satisfaction. Her young, healthy body was responding exactly as hoped, liver function normalizing, wound healing without infection. By the second day, she was sitting up, managing small sips of water, the color returning to her cheeks. The pain was significant but manageable, and Lily faced it with the same quiet determination she'd shown through everything else. She asked about Richard constantly, wanting to know if the transplant had worked, if he'd survived, if her sacrifice had meant something. Richard's recovery was more complicated. The transplant had been successful technically, the new liver portion accepted by his body, beginning its life-saving function. But he'd been sicker than anyone had fully realized, his body weakened by months of declining health. He developed an infection on the third day, his temperature spiking dangerously high, the ICU team scrambling to adjust antibiotics and manage his care. For 24 frightening hours, it was unclear whether he would make it despite everything Lily had given him. Sarah found herself in a strange position, sitting with Lily, who kept asking about a father she barely knew, while Marcus provided updates about Richard's condition from the floor above. Sarah harbored no love for Richard Ashford, would have been content to never see him again, if not for these circumstances. But watching Lily's anxiety, seeing her daughter's distress at the thought that her sacrifice might be for nothing, Sarah found herself hoping he would pull through. Not for his sake, but for Lily's, so her daughter wouldn't carry the weight of failed salvation. Richard stabilized on day 5, the infection responding to treatment, his own strength rallying in ways that surprised even his doctors. Dr. Morrison called it remarkable, this resilience in a man who'd seemed so close to death just weeks before. Sarah thought it was ironic, Richard fighting to survive now when he'd never fought for his daughter's place in his life. But biology didn't care about irony, and the liver Lily had given him was functioning beautifully, regenerating in both their bodies with nature's miraculous efficiency. The hospital allowed Sarah to wheel Lily up to Richard's room on day 7, both patients stable enough for a brief visit. Richard was awake but weak, monitors beeping softly around his bed, the pallor still evident but improving. He stared at Lily as she was wheeled in, this teenage girl with the bandages across her middle, who had undergone major surgery to save a stranger, wearing her father's face. Tears streamed down Richard's cheeks, the first emotion Sarah had seen from him that seemed entirely unguarded. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate and enormous all at once. Lily nodded, her own eyes bright with tears. "You're welcome," she said simply. "Now you have to do something with it. You have to make it mean something." Richard reached out a shaking hand, and Lily took it, the first physical contact between father and daughter in over a decade. Sarah watched from the doorway, her heart a confusion of protectiveness, hope, and fear. This was just the beginning, she realized. The surgery had been the easy part. The weeks following discharge were a study in contrasts. Lily returned to school within a month, her youth and health enabling a swift recovery that amazed her medical team. She moved gingerly at first, protecting her still-healing abdomen, but was soon back to her normal activities with only a scar to show for her sacrifice. Her classmates treated her like a hero, a label that made her uncomfortable. "I just did what anyone would do," she'd say, but Sarah knew that wasn't true. Most people couldn't, make the choice Lily had made, not with the history they shared. Richard's recovery was slower but steady. He'd been forced to step back from his company, leaving day-to-day operations to his board while he regained his strength. The man who'd once worked 18-hour days found himself with time, a commodity he'd never had in abundance and didn't quite know how to use. Marcus reported that Richard was different, quieter, more contemplative. The brush with mortality had changed something fundamental in him, cracked the armor of certainty that had defined his personality for decades. He started coming to Portland regularly, awkward visits where he'd take Lily and Sarah to dinner or simply sit in their apartment talking. The conversations were difficult at first, navigating years of absence and hurt, learning to be in each other's presence without the crisis of illness providing structure. Richard was clumsy in his attempts at fatherhood, buying expensive gifts that Lily politely declined, offering financial help that Sarah refused, trying to solve with money what could only be addressed with time and presence. But slowly, painfully, something resembling a relationship began to form. Richard showed up for Lily's academic awards ceremony, sitting in the audience beside Sarah, applauding as their daughter received recognition for her exceptional grades. He asked about her college plans, her dreams, her interests, actually listening to the answers rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He shared stories about his own life, not the corporate success tales, but the personal struggles, the regrets, the loneliness that success had bought him. He was learning, Lily said, learning how to be human rather than just successful. Sarah remained cautious, protective of her daughter, watching for signs that Richard might revert to his old patterns. She'd seen too much disappointment to trust easily, too many years of absence to believe change could happen quickly. But she also saw something genuine in Richard's efforts, a humility that hadn't existed before. The liver transplant had given him biological life, but something else was transforming him at a deeper level, a recognition of what he'd lost and what he might still salvage. The real test came when Lily's 16th birthday approached. Sarah had always made these occasions special despite their limited budget, traditions built over years of just the two of them. She was prepared for Richard to try to take over, to throw an elaborate party that would overshadow everything Sarah had built. Instead, he asked quietly what Lily wanted, what would make her happy. And when Lily said she wanted a small dinner with her mom, her best friend, and yes, her father if he wanted to come, Richard had smiled with something that looked like genuine joy. The dinner was at their apartment, Sarah's homemade pasta and the chocolate cake she baked every year, candles and laughter, and the comfortable warmth of people who cared about each other. Richard brought a single gift, a photo album he'd put together himself, filled with pictures of Lily through the years that he'd gotten from Sarah, each one annotated with Richard's handwritten notes about what he'd missed, what he wished he'd been there for, what he hoped to be present for going forward. It was a gift that acknowledged absence while reaching toward presence, and Lily held it against her chest, tears streaming down her face. "This is what I wanted," she whispered. "I just wanted you to see me." 2 years after the transplant, the three of them stood on the stage of Portland's Civic Center, facing a crowd gathered for the regional organ donor awareness event. Dr. Morrison had asked them to share their story, hoping it might inspire others to consider living donation, to understand the profound gift that one person could give another. Sarah had been reluctant, protective as always of Lily's privacy, but her daughter had insisted. "If our story can help someone else, we have to tell it," Lily had said, now 17 and even more certain of her values than she'd been at 15. Richard spoke first, his voice carrying through the auditorium with the confidence built over decades of public speaking, but tempered now with genuine emotion. He told the truth, all of it, the abandonment, the illness, the desperate request for help from a daughter he'd never bothered to know. He didn't soften his failures or paint himself as anything other than what he'd been, a man who'd made terrible choices and somehow been given an undeserved second chance. "My daughter saved my life," he said, "not just through surgery, but by showing me what it means to have courage, compassion, and integrity. She taught me that being a father isn't about biology or financial support. It's about showing up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Lily spoke next, her voice less practiced, but no less powerful. She talked about the anger and hurt of abandonment, the struggle to decide whether to help someone who'd never helped her, the realization that mercy wasn't about what others deserved but about who you chose to be. "I didn't do this because my father earned it," she said clearly. "I did it because I could, and because I wanted to be someone who chose compassion over bitterness. The surgery gave him my liver, but what happened after, that's what really mattered. He had to choose to be different, to be better. The transplant gave him time, but he had to decide what to do with it." Sarah finished, The mother who'd held everything together through years of struggle, who'd protected and provided when it would have been easier to give up. She talked about forgiveness, not as forgetting or excusing, but as releasing the weight of anger to make room for something new. "I didn't forgive Richard for his sake," she said. "I forgave him for mine. And for Lily's, because carrying that rage was exhausting and it wasn't helping us heal." But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending the past didn't happen. It meant acknowledging the hurt and choosing to move forward anyway. After the speeches, a woman approached them, tears streaming down her face. Her brother needed a kidney transplant, she explained, and she was a match, but she was terrified of the surgery, of the risks, of making such a permanent sacrifice. Lily took her hands. This stranger connected to them through the universal language of medical crisis and family obligation. "It's okay to be scared," Lily said gently. "It's a big decision, and only you can make it. But I can tell you that for me, being brave enough to do a hard thing changed my life in ways the surgery never could. It showed me who I wanted to be." The years that followed brought their own challenges. Richard remained involved in Lily's life, showing up for college orientations and holiday dinners, learning to be a father incrementally, imperfectly, but genuinely. He'd stepped back from his company entirely, using his wealth and influence to support medical research and education initiatives, trying to create meaning from his second chance. He'd never be the father he could have been if he'd stayed, never reclaim the lost years or erase the abandonment. But he was present now, and that was something. Lily went to medical school, inspired partly by her own experience, wanting to help others navigate the impossible decisions that medical crises forced upon families. She specialized in transplant medicine, the irony not lost on anyone. Sarah watched her daughter graduate, Richard beside her in the audience, both of them applauding this remarkable young woman they'd created together and then raised separately. Lily had become extraordinary not because of her father's belated involvement, but despite his absence, and yet his transformation had added something valuable too, proof that people could change, that redemption was possible even after catastrophic failure. On the 5th anniversary of the transplant, the three of them stood on the same beach where Lily had made her decision, watching the Pacific waves continue their eternal rhythm. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked quietly, the question he'd been afraid to voice for years. Lily considered, always honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable. "Sometimes I regret that you needed to be dying before you wanted to know me. Sometimes I'm angry about the years we lost. But the surgery itself? The choice to help? No. I don't regret that. It taught me that I'm capable of extraordinary courage, and that gift is mine to keep forever, regardless of what happened before or after." Richard nodded, accepting the complexity of her answer, the refusal to offer easy absolution. Sarah stood beside them, her daughter on one side, the man who'd been her husband a lifetime ago on the other. The three of them bound together by biology, sacrifice, and the messy business of trying to heal what had been broken. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and somewhere in Portland a teenager was making an impossible decision about whether to save a parent who'd failed them, perhaps reading about Lily's story, finding hope in the knowledge that courage could coexist with hurt, that mercy didn't require forgetting. "Thank you," Richard said again. The words he'd spoken countless times since the surgery, but they carried different weight now, not just gratitude for the liver that kept him alive, but for the chance to be better, to know his daughter, to understand what he'd almost lost forever. Lily smiled at him, the same smile she'd given him in that first awkward coffee shop meeting, cautious but genuine, willing to try. "You're welcome, Dad," she said, the words still unfamiliar on her tongue but growing more natural with time and presence. They walked back toward the parking lot together, Sarah's hand in Lily's, Richard following slightly behind, still learning his place in this family he'd abandoned and been allowed back into through grace he'd never earned. The story wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. Richard would struggle with being a father, falling back into old patterns of trying to solve problems with money, forgetting important dates, prioritizing work when he should prioritize presence. Lily would have days when the old anger resurfaced, when she questioned why she'd saved someone who'd hurt her so deeply. Sarah would remain vigilant, protective, never quite trusting that Richard wouldn't disappear again when things got difficult. But they were trying, all three of them, navigating this second chance with honesty about its limitations and hope for its possibilities. The transplant had saved Richard's life, but what Lily had really given him was something more profound: the opportunity to become the person he should have been all along, to learn that love required sacrifice, presence, and the courage to show up even when you'd failed before. Whether he would fully succeed remained to be seen, a story still being written in the small moments of daily life, in the choices he made when no one was watching, in the father he was slowly, painfully learning to become. As they drove away from the beach, Lily looked back at the ocean one last time, remembering the girl she'd been 5 years ago, waited with an impossible decision, wondering if she could live with either choice. She'd chosen mercy, and it had changed everything, not in the dramatic, instantaneous way of movies, but in the slow, incremental way that real transformation happened. She'd learned that being brave didn't mean not being afraid. It meant being terrified and choosing compassion anyway. She'd learned that forgiveness was possible without forgetting, that healing could coexist with scars, that redemption was a journey rather than a destination. The story of the billionaire who abandoned his daughter and the girl who saved him anyway would be told many times in the years that followed, in medical conferences and donor awareness campaigns, in ethics classes and family therapy sessions. Some would see it as a story of redemption, proof that people could change. Others would see it as a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition, the damage of absent parents, the unfairness of asking children to be more merciful than their parents ever were. Both interpretations held truth. But for Lily, Sarah, and Richard, it was simply their story, messy and complicated and still unfolding, a testament to the reality that life rarely offered neat resolutions or uncomplicated endings. They'd been broken by abandonment and brought together by crisis, held apart by hurt and drawn closer by the possibility of healing. What they built from those contradictions would never be perfect, could never erase what had been lost, but it was theirs, earned through courage, sacrifice, and the difficult choice to try when giving up would have been easier. The little girl who'd been abandoned had become a young woman who saved lives, not just through medicine but through the example she set of choosing compassion over bitterness, of finding strength in mercy, of believing that people, however flawed, however late, could still choose to be better. And perhaps that was the real gift she'd given, not to her father, but to herself and everyone who heard their story, proof that even from abandonment and pain, something redemptive could grow, if you were brave enough to give it the chance.